Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is pretty focused. We are jumping into the latest economic data we have for two major global powers, Russia and China.
That's right.
We're using the newest figures from November, December 2025 to try and, cut through the official narratives and see what's really happening on the ground.
Exactly. The goal is to get beyond just the headline GDP numbers. We're looking for those little nuggets of data that reveal the real constraints they're facing.
Right.
We want to see how these big internal issues like, say, massive military costs or weak consumer demand are clashing with external pressures like sanctions to basically limit what they can do.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We should probably start with Russia, where it seems like the staggering cost of the conflict is becoming impossible to hide.
It really is.
Not just in the government's books, but in the choices families are having to make every day. The official line is all about resilience, but the data, it tells a much different story. A story of stagnation.
It absolutely does. The official narrative keeps stressing stability, but the core data we're seeing for 2025 points to this undeniable slowdown. Russia's growth is just weak.
Yeah.
They've trimmed the official forecast down to, maybe 0.5% to 1.0%?
That's practically idling.
It is.
I see.
This is not a healthy, dynamic economy.
And these aren't just abstract numbers, right? This is hitting real-world sectors. I mean, look at housing starts. That's always a classic indicator of confidence.
Huge one.
And they're down roughly 2.4% year over year. When people start building houses, that signals a pretty broad lack of confidence in the future.
And this is all happening while the government is facing this immense fiscal squeeze. The deficit has widened. It's sitting around 2% of GDP now for the first 11 months of 2025.
So less money coming in, more money going out.
Precisely. It's a collision of two forces. You've got weaker oil revenue coming in on one side, and on the other, just relentlessly high military spending rushing out.
And the scale of that spending it's truly enormous. Can you walk us through those projections? What are we looking at for defense outlays in 2025?
The projected number is 17 trillion rubles.
Wow.
Yeah. And to put that into context for everyone, that figure is about 41% of the total state spending for the entire year.
41%.
41%. When you dedicate that much of your budget to one thing, it creates this immediate crowding out effect. Every ruble spent on the military is a ruble you can't spend on hospitals or roads or social programs. It forces some really painful trade-offs.
Which leads us straight to this fascinating but really troubling low unemployment paradox. The official rate is historically low, like 2-3%. But how can that be if the civilian economy is struggling so much?
This is where the distortion is just so visible.
Yeah.
That low number, it doesn't signal a healthy economy. It actually reflects an acute labor shortage.
A shortage?
Yes. You have thousands of workers either mobilized for the military or they're working in defense plants or they've just left the country altogether. So it masks this severe weakness everywhere else. Civilian factories can't find people. Businesses are starved for talent. All while the headline number looks great.
So high employment is actually a symptom of the war economy, not a benefit for society. At the same time, the pressure on their revenue is getting tighter, right? What about the latest sanctions?
The sanctions are getting smarter, more targeted. In mid-December, the EU rolled out new measures aimed specifically at Russia's oil shadow fleet and the traders who helped them.
The shadow fleet, for anyone not familiar, that's basically a bunch of old, uninsured tankers moving Russian oil at a discount, right?
That's the one. They operate outside of Western regulations, and the goal of hitting that fleet is to make it much harder and more expensive for them to move that oil.
To choke off the revenue stream.
Exactly. And it's working. Their oil and fuel export revenue in November hit the lowest point since the invasion started in 2022. So even with all these sales to India and China, the steep discounts they're forced to offer just aren't covering the state's massive bills.
Which means the government's wallet is shrinking and they have to react. What does that look like? I'm guessing tax hikes and austerity.
It's inevitable. They have a huge revenue gap to close. The government is already planning austerity measures, cuts across civilian programs, and everyone is bracing for a hike in the VAT, the value-added tax.
And that's a direct tax on consumption. People will pay more for almost everything.
Yes. So households are being squeezed from both sides.
Yeah.
Consumer demand is clearly pulling back. You see people shifting to discount stores, only buying essentials.
And all this while inflation is still high.
Still very high. It's
Yeah.
hovering around 6.6 to 6.9%. So you combine that inflation with planned tax hikes, and people's real incomes, what they can actually afford to buy, are just eroding fast.
So the big takeaway for Russia is the economy isn't collapsing in a dramatic sense, but it is structurally broken. It's completely distorted by the war.
And that distortion is forcing dependency. This whole strategic pivot to China, the new gas pipeline, it's a move of necessity, not strength. They're locking themselves into a few buyers who then have all the leverage, which really begs the question, how long can you sustain spending 41% of your budget on the military before you have to make crippling cuts to civilian life?
A very tough picture. An economy dictated by conflict, not prosperity.
Okay, let's shift gears completely now. Let's talk about China.
Right.
Because here, the main problem isn't an external conflict. It's a struggling domestic engine that just can't seem to get going.
That is the big paradox of China's economy right now. I mean, on the one hand, their external sector, their export machine it's a monster. A record trade surplus of over $1 trillion. They are incredibly competitive globally.
So if you're bringing in that much money, $1 trillion surplus, why does the domestic picture look so kicky? Shouldn't that capital provide a huge buffer? You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the internal drag is just so structural, so deep. What we're seeing is this persistent weakness in domestic demand. The November data shows consumption is slowing, investment is slowing, and the big one, the property sector is in immense distress.
Tell us more about that. We hear about developers going bankrupt, but why is that such a powerful drag on the whole economy?
Because property in China is tied to everything. For years, local governments funded themselves by selling land to developers. When the property market tanks, that revenue just vanishes. They can't fund basic services.
And what about regular people?
For households, the vast majority of their personal wealth is tied up in real estate. So when property values fall, their life savings evaporate. Consumer confidence is shattered. And they stop spending. They just save every penny they can.
And you can see that lack of confidence in the price signals, can't you? The official CPI inflation is incredibly low, something like 0.7%.
Exactly. And while 0.7% might sound good, what it really signals is a risk of deflation.
A deflationary trap.
The trap. When consumers think prices will be even lower tomorrow, they put off buying things today. They wait. And that expectation itself causes the economy to slow down even more. It's a really vicious cycle.
So consumers are scared. They're saving, not spending. What is the government doing about it? Is Beijing planning some huge stimulus package to kickstart things?
Well, surprisingly, they're being very cautious. And a lot of analysts are worried. Fiscal revenue growth is tiny, only 0.8% year over year. That doesn't give them a lot of room to act boldly. It seems they're not going for a massive debt-fueled stimulus right now.
And that might not be enough.
A lot of people are warning it's just not enough to overcome the fear gripping consumers, especially with the property crisis.
And we also have to mention jobs, because you can't have a consumer base without confident workers. The overall urban unemployment rate looks stable, around 5.1%, but there are these huge concerns about youth underemployment, aren't there?
That's the other structural weakness hidden in the main number. If you have university graduates who can only find low-quality, precarious work, you're failing to build that future middle-class consumer base.
Yeah.
It's a long-term problem that state media doesn't like to talk about, but it's there.
So we've got two huge economies with two very different problems. Let's try and synthesize this. This is really a tale of two constraints.
It is. If you step back, both countries are facing stagnation, but for completely different reasons. Russia is constrained by external factors, the sanctions, the war driving this unsustainable fiscal burden and forcing it to depend on just a few friends.
While China is constrained by internal structural factors, the real estate crisis, weak consumer confidence, all these things are preventing it from making that shift to a sustainable, consumer-driven economy.
And in both countries, you see the state narratives trying so hard to project strength and stability. In Russia, Putin talks about stability, but independent analysts see a budget deficit nearing 3% of GDP and rising poverty.
And in China, you hear all about plans to boost consumption, but the data from the ground shows that people are just too cautious to spend.
Exactly.
So what does all this mean for you, listening at home? It means that while the state narratives are powerful, the underlying data on household spending, on jobs, on fiscal health suggests that rising domestic strains are the real story. These strains are what will ultimately define the limits of their power on the global stage.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider. Both of these nations rely heavily on state-controlled data to project an image of stability. So think about how this rising social hardship, the falling confidence, the austerity in Russia, the property crisis in China, how might that hardship eventually exert political pressure on decisions that right now seem to be driven purely by military goals or ideology?
How long can domestic pain be ignored? It's a fundamental question of trade-offs, and it's one that ordinary citizens in both of these countries are being forced to answer right now. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.
We hope you're leaving a little better informed. We'll talk to you next time.